Before we go any further, and last week, I swear we were talking about Jesus Christ, who died last week? They were talking about Don Fargo. My God, I went blank on poor Don Fargo that we did, just trying to tell an uplifting story about last week on the program.
Which you did, and it was very funny.
Which we did, and it was funny. And then suddenly, within a day after, I guess, the program went up, we had already taped it, obviously, Nick Bockwinkel passed away. And I mean, no two more polar opposite people as far as just people could Nick Bockwinkel and Don Fargo, great as they both were in their own way, be, but they were just completely opposite. I mean, my God, I can't imagine any more opposite people. But they, once again, it's another link to a generation, to an age, to a time in wrestling that we're not going to have anymore. And the fact that Nick, I mean, he's one of the few guys that could actually turn down consideration for the NWA World Championship because he was too happy in the spot where he was at. I mean, there have been so many bios and everything's going to be written about him, and the Observer issue, I'm sure this week is going to be a tremendous tribute to him. But I got one. I have more than one, but I'm going to tell one Nick Bockwinkel story. It was when I first got into business here in Memphis. It was right in the fall of '82. Right when he and Lawler, Bockwinkel and Lawler, were about to start another program for the AWA Championship. And Nick would come into Memphis, and he had been since 78, every, 6 months or a year, and defend the championship and work a program with Jerry. And this one was the one where finally they did the deal where Lawler pinned Nick. Even though he had his feet on the ropes, Lawler pinned him in the Mid-South Coliseum in front of a sellout crowd, and the people thought that he had finally won the world championship after all that time. And they announced then the following week on TV that the title had been held up pending review. And then, of course, Bockwinkel came back 2 weeks later, and they had a rematch, obviously, for the held up title. And that's Andy Kaufman got involved, and Lawler ended up on the short end of it with Jimmy Hart and Andy Kaufman involved. And that always, one of the things that impacted me personally at that time in my career was that I ended up with the biggest credit for biggest drop in the main event house in the history of Memphis. The Lawler winning the title, sold out, did like 39 grand. The next week with no Lawler, and the title was held up, and no Bockwinkel, and it was me and Adrian Street and Miss Linda against Bill Dundee and Jerry Calhoun in the main event. Did like 12 grand. So we dropped 27 grand. And then the next week, Bockwinkel came back and wrestled Lawler, and they sold out again. So,
you, my friend, are poison.
I was box office poison. But anyway, I also, Nick came to Louisville. And at that time, I was still living in Louisville. And whereas all of the talent would leave the matches in Louisville and they'd head back to Nashville usually, after, on Tuesday nights, or they would maybe go on to Evansville or whatever. There was very few people that had a car and were sticking around and whatever. And I actually got the opportunity. I've been in the business 3 months, even though I've been a photographer for 6-7 years, whatever. So I'd spoken to Nick, but as a professional, I now get to squire Nick Bockwinkel out to dinner in Louisville, Kentucky after the matches, right? Mm. And then take him to his hotel before I go back home. He's like, do you know any place to eat? Well, if we're downtown Louisville and it was a Tuesday night, it was like 10:30 at night, automatically your options dropped dramatically, right? If you didn't want White Castle or someplace involving the word shack in the name. But I said, well, we're just a few blocks from Kingfish. And I look back on it now. Kingfish at the time, it was a noted local Louisville seafood place. We're basically, for your fried seafood platter, the Captain Kingfish with this, riverboat, the steamship, the whole 9 yards on their logo. And it's pretty good for local and Tuesday night, but it's Nick Bockwinkel. And I was 20 years old then. Now that I'm a worldly traveler and have eaten decent meals out in public, I realize Nick Bockwinkel let this fucking greenhorn 20-year-old photographer turned manager take him to Kingfish in Louisville for Tuesday night dinner after his incredible 30-minute world championship match with Jerry Lawler, right? But Nick was so cool and so nice, and it answered questions that I'm sure I sounded like a mark asking, and imparted wisdom and encouragement. And, but here's a guy who has been literally, that was almost 30 years since he'd started. He was a teenager because he was second generation wrestler. And he was, at that time, he was 48 years old, and he was doing half an hour every night with Jerry Lawler. Well, every night, 2 or 3 nights in a row, and he'd go back home to Minneapolis. But it just, he was an amazing kind of guy and an amazing talent and a tremendous performer. And he got better in his 40s, and he was in an amazing physical shape. But that was the, the thing is that one of the things that I got to ask him during my dinner with him at Kingfish was, you've been in Minneapolis so long, most of the time guys leave, territories, every year to 6 months, even sometimes, definitely every year or two. And it's very, unusual for guys to stay so long. And you've been there for, over 10 years now. He's like, here's the deal. Vern had all the major Midwest cities and was encroaching on the West Coast at that point. As cities would open up, nobody was running them. He had major TV. They ran 15 times a month usually, or maybe a little bit more. In the summer, they'd go a month or 6 weeks where they wouldn't run at all, just take a break. And as a top heel, he was making $150,000 a year. And that was in 1982 for working half the month and being home and the other half in a place where they got the boats and the lakes and the and they flew everywhere because it wasn't like driving to, a spot show type territory. It was major cities over a large area, so they flew everywhere. So the point is, he didn't want to give that up to the point where he was at one point under consideration on the short list of guys who could carry the NWA title, and he like, nope, never mind. He would make more money, but he wouldn't make twice as much money as he was making to do more than twice the work and the traveling.
Well, sometimes it's more about quality of life than quantity of cash.
Yeah, and also by that point he was once again in his mid 40s, and but Bockwinkel, he was just a special kind of talent, and everybody that he was very he was the original inspiration for one of Vince's favorite sayings. If you ask him what time it was, he'd tell you how to build the watch. He was very, and that line was somewhere on one of the obituaries this week. But Vince used to use that in honor, I think, of Nick. He was very well spoken and verbose, and he made that part of his gimmick and his personality, and he did it the condescending heel so much better than anybody. But then finally, he finished out his career as a babyface, as an icon, especially in the Midwest, because he'd been so good for so long. He's one of those guys. It was like Flair. How can you hate somebody that's been so good for so long? So anyway, but I got to take him to dinner and history does not remember. I think I probably offered to pay, and I believe he probably picked it up because I took him to his hotel. So, and it was probably like $9 at that point. So I think he could probably bear up under it, but it was nice of him to do it.
I have to ask, was he the world-renowned rapper that he is now? At that point?
No, what now?
Wrestle Rock Rumble.
Oh, Jesus Christ, that's right. Yes,
He was the only one that did it well.
Well, I'm sure he probably went home and studied, probably, because that was up to Nick takes the shit like that seriously. He probably practiced.
Yeah, and I meant no disrespect by it, but when I found out that he had passed, I turned to Darren and I said, "Have you seen the Wrestle Rock Rumble?" Because he didn't.
Of all the Nick Bockwinkel shit you could think of, his great matches with Billy Robinson and Vern Gagne and Jerry Lawler and all these other people, and matches with Ray Stevens against Bruiser and Crusher in Chicago, and you think of the Wrestle Rock Rumble.
Well, I have to say, he had the same response you did, because right after that, we watched a video of you watching Wrestle Rock Rumble.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I remember that.
And he's like, well, look at that. He's the one guy that can keep the beat. And I'm like, yeah, it's pretty cool.